Today I'll be talking about the 460 tender engines of Ireland. I very well may be missing something, as I only found 4 of them. I'll go over each one of them in a not excessive way while addressing, hopefully, all of the basics. I don't know much, if anything, about the culture around the railways there, or most of the people involved. Today I've learned a little bit about the people, and quite a lot about a few of the engines. Firstly, in 1905, the Great Southern and Western Railway completed its first 460 tender engine, and the first in Ireland, to my knowledge. It was designed by Robert Coey, and the class would total 6 engines by 1907, all built by the railway's own Inchicore Works. This will be the first engine we cover. The 362s, as they were known, were actually built for goods traffic, intended to be more powerful than Coey's previous 355 class 060s. While the 362s were the first mainline use of the 460 wheel arrangement in Ireland, it had been previously used on tank engines. This application was very different, however, and the leading bogey was largely to lighten axle load, bringing the axle load down to just 16 tons. They had a 160 psi boiler, 2 19¼ inch cylinders, and driving wheels just under 5 foot 2 inches. They were quite long for their time and place, giving them the nickname Long Toms. The 260 wheel arrangement had already been in use in Ireland, and was quite successful in this sort of work. More power was needed though, and more power they got. There were drawbacks, however. They were too long for some turntables, and because the bogie was so lightly loaded, they had a tendency to derail. The 355s were full of problems themselves, however. They were heavy, awkward, hard on the track, so they'd be rebuilt as moguls, and in this form they outdid the 362s. The 362s were withdrawn between 1928 and 1931, with a class life of 26 years. The 355s, however, in their rebuilt form would outlive them significantly. Next, we have the Great Southern and Western 400 class, also known as the B2s and B2As. They were the second class of 460 built for the Great Southern and Western. They were designed for express work by Edward A. Watson, who had a history on the Pennsylvania Railroad and Great Western Railway. In 1913, he became CME at Inchicore Works, and 3 years later introduced prototype number 400. Having come from the Great Western Railway and having good connections there, he was heavily influenced by the Great Western's Star class, which he had borrowed drawings for. Its cylinder arrangement was quite similar, with the inside cylinders set forward to drive the first axle. The much larger engine had slightly thinner frames, however, and as such, the frames were prone to flexing, causing steam pipes to break. The firebox was different as well, and the steaming characteristics were likely different due to this. Additionally, the Star class had a boiler pressure of 225 psi, whereas number 400 had only 175 psi, which was high for Ireland, but low compared to what was happening over on the Great Western. In 1921, 3 examples of the class would be built with improvements: stronger frames, better steam pipe layout and different superheater, and better lubricators. The axle load increased as well, going over 18 tons. In 1923, 6 more were built, with bigger tenders. 3 of the engines weren't superheated, but had higher pressure. The unsuperheated engines performed worse though, and were converted to superheating. All of the upgrades up to this point hadn't solved the reliability problems the class had. That said, they were certainly fast, and could run well even on the worst coal. As such, they were kept on until something could be done about them. In this form, they were actually the flagship locomotives of the railway. When Watson's replacement, Bazin, got into office, he had to fix these engines, and fast. It was a bad look having your flagship engines suck. So he talked with Richard Monsell, who sent his chief designer over to help with the fixing of these engines. This designer was none other than Harry Holcroft, who is perhaps best known for designing his own conjugated valve gear, nearly a decade before Sir Nigel Gresley did it. Eventually, he made it effectively immune to falling out of time as things heated and cooled. He was a smart man, and his consultation must have helped an awful lot in the next bit of this story. Before getting around to fixing the 400s, he took the 400's boiler and built another 460 out of it, meant for mixed traffic. It turned out to be absolutely fantastic. Number 500 proved capable of running expresses despite absolutely not being built for it. In this time, some of the same design principles were used to make a very successful mogul, but perhaps that's a subject for another day. In 1925, the railways of Ireland amalgamated, forming the Great Southern Railway, and Bazin had to keep up with all of it. It wasn't until 1927 that he found the time between his immense responsibilities to do a rebuild of number 402, taking after the success of number 500, and the advice from Holcroft. Much of the engine was thrown out altogether, and the process was very costly. The result was a successful two-cylinder engine. It was reliable and cheaper to run, and number 402 would remain the favorite of the class even after other members were dealt with. The other members of the class had a much harder time than 402. Money wasn't there, and so 4 of the engines, which were built by Armstrong Whitworth, were cut up for scrap, including the prototype. Numbers 401 and 406 were given a similar rebuild, but with Caprotti valve gear, earning them the B2A classification. This left 6 capable engines to run the Dublin to Cork services, 3 members of the 400 class and all 3 members of the 500 class. Later, in 1938, number 407 got the rebuild treatment and finally joined the ranks as a capable express engine. In 1955, the first of the rebuilt engines was scrapped, and the last of the rebuilt engines finally went out in 1961. Meaning the class lifespan totaled 46 years, impressive for engines which certainly could have been considered failures. Next, the 500s. This bit will be quite short. They were built with influence of Harry Holcroft, and Bazin was seeking to avoid some issues with the 400s. They were specifically meant for mixed traffic, with 5'8" driving wheels and the same boiler as the 400 class. The first was made in 1924, and the last was out by 1926. The class totaled only 3 engines, but they'd often find themselves in the domain of the 400s, taking fast express trains. They would have had more than adequate acceleration, but their top speed left something to be desired. It would later be said that they were well suited to night mails and goods, but no more. However, they made do for a time. Between 1956 and 1957, the class was withdrawn. Now on to the big ones. The 800 class, also known as the Queens. These were the largest and most powerful engines to ever run in Ireland by quite some distance. The class of 3 were built between 1939 and 1940 to tackle the fastest and heaviest trains Ireland could throw at them. And that's just what they did. They were known for tackling the steepest grades on the main line without any assistance, and they came with a boiler pressure of 225 psi to power giant 6'7" driving wheels. They had 3 cylinders, and were the only engines in Ireland that properly used the wide loading gauge to their advantage. It's a shame, then, that the Queens never got to prove themselves. You see, after World War II, there was a coal shortage, and it wasn't worth steaming them up to full pressure, so they set their valves to blow off at 180 psi. Dieselization was on the horizon as they were being built, and in the 1950s, the first generation of diesels hit Ireland. The Metropolitan Vickers A-Class took over. Superior acceleration and a top speed of 75 miles an hour meant the Queens weren't needed anymore. Grades they would have struggled on were handled even better, and while they were truly good engines, they were already obsolete. They were let out sometimes to pull light expresses, but in 1955, one of the engines was taken out of service. In 1964, another one of the Queens was taken out for a rail tour and promptly scrapped. The first of the class to be built would be the last to survive. Number 800 Maeve was withdrawn, repainted, and preserved. She sits on static display with a handful of other preserved engines to this day. This engine had an interesting record, as before the class's boiler pressure was lowered, she hit 96 miles an hour, putting her up there as a contender for 100 miles an hour, though it's likely she'll never move again. It's a real shame, too, as she's the only preserved Irish 460, and one of, frankly, a very small group of preserved engines. Hey guys, there wasn't a whole lot of pictures to work off of for this video. The next one should be a little bit better. It's going to be a very short one on the Caledonian Railway Class 1s. That's going to be a very short video. And after that, at some point, the Dean Experiments video will come out, but I'm only halfway through writing the script for that because a lot of things came up at work. If you have any suggestions or anything like that, requests, whatever, hit me with them and I'll add them to the list. Thanks for watching.